APLA organiza la primera reunión virtual latinoamericana de petroquímica, que tendrá como objetivo generar un espacio de nuevas experiencias y oportunidades, desafiando las nuevas tecnologías y adaptándonos a los nuevos paradigmas de negocios. Sigamos conectados. APLA anual virtual, 9 y 10 de noviembre. Los esperamos.
Muy buenos días y muchas gracias por unirse a una nueva sesión con expertos. Hoy estará con nosotros Vincent Follaca, Senior Business Development Manager de LIQUIDE, presentando tecnologías y soluciones para la captura de dióxido de carbono en procesos con emisión. Vincent se encarga de brindar soluciones low carbon a empresas industriales que buscan aprovechar sus emisiones de CO2. Con esta pequeña introducción, Vincent, bienvenido. Please welcome.
APLA organiza la primera reunión virtual latinoamericana de petroquímica, que tendrá como objetivo generar un espacio de nuevas experiencias y oportunidades, desafiando las nuevas tecnologías y adaptándonos a los nuevos paradigmas de negocios. Sigamos conectados. APLA anual virtual, 9 y 10 de noviembre. Los esperamos.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for attending today's presentation. I'm going to present you the vision of carbon capture and storage in North America, and specifically in the United States through this presentation. Also going to show what the technology is, what the potential market is, as well as the Air Liquide involvement in that space. So before we start, always interesting to put that in context, and I find this chart very self-explanatory on where we are today with regards to CO2. So, this is 800,000 years ago, the past 800,000 years, CO2 content in the atmosphere, and we see here clearly the peak that we're observing, and all that is that line here is 100-year in Earth's history. Back in 2008, 400 ppm CO2 were already above 1 degree temperature elevation. The 2100 estimates are showing a CO2 concentration between 550 and 900 ppm, and it's an Earth temperature increase between 4.5 and way above 6 degrees. So it's pretty high, and that's basically what we're looking at today, and what forces us to do something for CO2 emissions. And we know what to do. Unfortunately, we're not doing it well so far. You see here detailed emissions of CO2 in the atmosphere since 1950, and we can see that the world has multiplied the emissions by 5 times since 1950. So the emissions keep increasing. That's the red curve, and in blue curve, it's specifically the US, United States, we're going to talk about today. So it increased by around 100%. You see, it's kind of stabilizing for the past 10 years. There are few reasons for that transition from coal to gas, but also a large deployment of renewable power. What we should be doing, though, to remain within what the UN are calling the 2-degree scenario, which is a maximum 2-degree temperature increase, we would have to reduce our CO2 emission by 2050 by around 60% compared to today. So these emissions with the actual pace are going to continue increasing. And although they're increasing, we still have to be 60% below today. So you see, it's a huge effort. It's a huge effort not to hit the 6-degree temperature increase. So you see on the right what actually we should be doing, and there are ways to do that. We need to hurry up, but there are still ways to do that. And one way I want to talk to you about today is carbon capture and storage. And that's one of the 5 major directions which is foreseen for reducing the total CO2 emission, along with energy efficiency, renewable energy, fuel switching, talking about electric vehicles, and nuclear industry. It's estimated, and it's only an estimate, that carbon capture and storage can help up to 10% in reducing the CO2 emission, and some projections say 15. So it's something which is worth exploring, and we have today the tools to do that. So what is carbon capture and storage? CO2 is normally emitted to the atmosphere. The point here is to capture it and store it, preventing it to be released into the air. Very simply, there are carbon capture plants that can be put close to our industrial plants, our refineries, our petrochemical plants, our power plants, cement plants, etc., which are industrial emissions. And the CO2 captured is stored underground. And this view here shows basically the relationship between the above surface and below the surface. So the CO2 you capture above ground, you will try to find a right geological formation to store it. And that's basically what happens on the ground. That's basically what happens on the ground when gas or oil is stored for millions of years. You have these geological formations with what we call a cap rock, which is kind of a seal, and a porous rock where you can trap some molecules, some gas. So that's what we're after. We're after these geological formations where we know CO2 will remain for hundreds of millions of years. And to do that, we're looking at it's a close collaboration between the CO2 emitters, those who are emitting the CO2, and the companies that are able to read what's happening underground. So typically upstream oil and gas exploration companies that know how to analyze geologic formations and tell us whether a rock is good or not to trap CO2. So to make it simple, you have a CO2 source, which is a plant, a power plant. You have a CCS plant, which is a carbon capture and storage plant, which will capture the CO2. You have a well in which you inject the CO2, and you have the storage side where you're going to store the CO2. And so that's what we're doing. That's what we're after. We're after these plants where the CO2 is easily capturable, and we're after this geographic location where there are very nice storage sites. And now I'm going to talk about the US a little bit more. The US today account for 15% of global CO2 emissions. So it is important that in the US we do something about CO2 if we want to achieve this 2-degree scenario and even below. And what I keep telling around me, you know, to my colleagues in other continents and today to you is that US are a great location to do carbon capture and storage for different reasons that you will see in this map, which shows pretty nicely the situation. In blue, you see the favorable geologic storage formation. So where, remember last slide, you have this cap rock and porous rock. These areas in blue are perfect to do that. You have a great cap rock, you have a great seal, and you have a great porous rock. Why? Because these regions are typical or conventional oil and gas regions. So where you find oil, when you find gas, you also find a good cap rock. This is why CO2 capture and storage is possible and is more likely in regions where there is oil production. The second advantage of the US is that there are CO2 pipelines existing. So that means you can transfer the CO2 from point A to a storage location, because you're not always lucky to have a good storage just under your feet. So most of the time, you're going to have to ship this CO2, you're going to have to transfer it, and pipeline is a great way. But pipeline costs money, so we're lucky here in the US to already have some pipeline existing. And actually, we have 90% of the world's CO2 pipeline in the US. And last but not least, there is a lot of CO2. So one could tell me it's not an advantage, you know, it would be better not having that CO2. That's absolutely true. The one which is here, however, we have a chance to capture it and store it because we have nice storage location. We already have pipeline, and we have a quite dynamic oil and gas industry. So we know how to drill, we know how to drill wells, we know how to read geologic reports. There is a strong industry behind that, so it's also easy to go and find someone who can drill a CO2 well for you, or someone who can build a CO2 pipeline for you. So that infrastructure, that ecosystem exists already. So key question is, okay, it's nice to think about storing it, but how much does that cost? You know, eventually it comes down on, you know, someone putting the money to build this plant, to build the well, to build the pipeline, to do the geological research. That costs money, you know, and money doesn't fall from the sky. So what you see here is a very nice curve. This has been done quite recently by the US National Petroleum Council. It basically tells you how much it's going to cost to capture all the different CO2 sources. And what we can see, I mean, we're only going to be looking at what's below $100 per ton. So that's the part in blue. So dollar per ton is how we measure the cost of capture. You know, how many dollars do we need to pay to get 1 ton of CO2 stored in the ground? And you see that if we look at this $100 threshold, there's around 500 million tons per year that could be captured for less than $100 per ton. Of course, we're not going to start immediately by the most expensive one. I mean, the key here is to say that we're going to start by the cheapest sources of CO2. Why? Because, you know, cheaper is easier. So we're going to go after that, and we have what we call for the next 5 years the activation phase, where everybody kind of agree that we can go up to 35 million tons per year of CO2 captured below $50 per ton. Then the expansion phase will get another 100 million tons per year of CO2 capture for something between, you know, 50 and 90. And the remaining 350 million tons per year would be in the range of $100 per ton. So this is a very interesting curve because it basically tells you what's the market size. You know, so it's 35 million tons per year short term, 500 million tons per year long term. And now when you look at that, you say, okay, is my technology allowing allowing to get to that cost. And who's going to pay? Who's going to pay that cost as well? So we're going to talk about that. First, talking about technology. The technology is not new. The first carbon and capture storage plant were built in 1972. So we're talking more than 40 years ago, almost now 50 years ago. And we're lucky in the US to have seen the oil and gas industry pushing for these projects. So we also have the experience. And you see here a nice picture of an Air Liquide CO2 capture plant in France. So that's one we built in 2015 in a refinery. It's in the north of France, in Normandy. I had the chance to go there 2 years ago. Very, very nice and neat plant, operating very nicely. This one captures around 300 tons of CO2 per day. So how to pay for that? Because we still have experience, we have technology, but 10% CO2 reduction means something in the range of 3 to 5 gigatons of CO2 per year. So we're looking at huge quantities of CO2 that are needed to be captured. So we need to see CCS projects all around. So how to advance that? Of course, regulatory framework is important. And we see in certain countries net zero objectives. We also see some major companies advancing net zero goals or even progressive CO2 reduction. We've announced a 30% CO2 intensity reduction by 2025. So we have also these objectives that we're committing to. Technology will improve. There is still a lot of R&D. There's still a lot of new technologies that are coming. And eventually, as you build more plants, the plants get more and more competitive. You have synergies, economies of scale, series effect. That's what we're looking at. One system we have in the US, which is pretty favorable, and we're really lucky to have that, is that the federal government passed a bill in 2018 to subsidize carbon capture. So that's what we call 45Q bill, and that's how we refer to it in the industry. And what 45Q will give you is $50 per ton of CO2 that you will store on the ground. So remember this nice cost curve. Now you get the $50. So with $50, remember you get up to 30 to 40 million tons per year of CO2 capture. And all these projects, they have to start before beginning of 2024. So the government is telling us, if you want these credits, you have to build this plant fast. You have to build them within the next 3 years. If you miss that date, you're not getting the credits. So that's a very good tool, because $50 per ton is quite high. It's probably one of the highest CO2 credit worldwide. The other tool we have is what we call the LCFS. LCFS stands for Low Carbon Fuel Standard. Fuel standard, because it addresses fuels. We all know that cars and planes and ships are responsible for a large chunk of CO2 emissions. That's what states like California are after. So it's really a state regulation. It's not countrywide. It's only California and other states in the West Coast, Oregon, British Columbia, etc. And one of the reasons they're after fuels, you probably know these huge cities, Los Angeles, San Francisco, a lot of car pollution. So it's also important to decarbonize these cities for better quality of living. So how does the LCFS work? The LCFS tells you how much CO2 you're allowed to emit per gallon of fuel. So how much CO2 can you emit when you consume 1 gallon of gasoline with your car? So California tells you that, and if your fuel is a biofuel, or if you're an electrical vehicle, or if you're using hydrogen for your car or natural gas, you're going to be below this number and you're going to be generating credits, and you're going to sell these credits to those companies that are not able to produce clean fuels. They will have to pay a penalty, and the price for this penalty is extremely high. It's between $150 and $200 per ton. And what you see on the curve here on the right is the cost of these credits when between the time where the system was implemented around 2013 up to last year. And we see two things. First, we see that the value has increased tremendously. So from a $20 starting point, we're now at $180, and even more recently, we have had the peaks in the $200. And also the volumes of credits are increasing because what California does is that the target decreases every year. So because they want to decrease, 30% CO2 emissions by 2030, instead of waiting 2029 and say, okay, now everyone, you have to go down by 30% and no one's ready. What they're telling is that, okay, we're going to start now, but every year you're going to decrease by 2-3%. So what you're seeing here is that these companies that hadn't started before, now they are forced to buy credits. So the volumes of credits transacted is increasing because everyone is forced now to get under a more and more stringent threshold. So when you add up these two numbers, 45Q and LCFS, you're way above $200 per ton. So that opens door to even more sources of CO2 to capture. There's another way to pay for CO2 capture because you don't always want to rely on government or states to pay for your business. You want other source of revenue, market sources of revenue, and one source of revenue for that is what we call EOR. EOR stands for Enhanced Oil Recovery. And it's based on something very simple. It's linked to the oil and gas industry. Is that when you start operating an oil field, the field will produce quite naturally some oil and gas because there's some pressure on the ground. The oil will flow to the surface. After a while, you see that primary production, which is between 5 and 40% of the total oil contained, it starts decreasing. So if you don't do nothing, pretty soon your output will going to be zero, and the well will stop producing. And it will stop producing, but still having a lot of oil in place. So what you do, you add you send water, brackish water, and you pump brackish water underground to increase the pressure of the reservoir. Once you're done with that, you can get another 10 to 30%. That's called secondary recovery. And now where we're at the time where there's still oil in place. And what you do to get it is you inject CO2. Inject CO2 to get the remaining 10 to 30% of oil in place in the field. So it's a very simple way. You basically inject CO2. The CO2 will mix with the oil, and it will make the oil much more fluid, much more liquid. At the same time, increase the pressure in the reservoir, so that way the oil can flow. So now, if we step back a little bit and understand what's happening, you have this injection CO2 well here, and you have this producing well, producing because it's producing oil. Now we're going to the surface. Where is the CO2 coming from? The CO2 comes from the same CO2 capture plant that you saw in the first slide, and for which we're supplying different technologies. We inject the CO2 underground, recover the oil, sell the oil, recover the CO2. That way, the CO2, after multiple injection cycles, remains trapped underground. So at the same time you're producing more oil, you store CO2. So this oil you're producing has a kind of almost a neutral CO2 effect, because the amount of CO2 you inject is equal to the amount of CO2 generated by the combustion of this oil. So now you have a CO2 neutral oil, And that's one of the interests of this technique, is that you store CO2 while generating revenue from a relatively clean product. And Air Liquide has been involved in CO2 capture project for quite a while. This is a map of all our CO2 capture projects. I guess our next step would be hopefully South America, where we're still the map still needs to add more points. But we have, you see here, multiple market that we're addressing, and you see these small logos up here: steel market, the hydrogen market, the natural gas market, power and cement. We have these CO2 hubs where CO2 is liquefied and put into large pipeline networks or ships to be transferred to large sequestration hubs. And these technologies are built on very well-known technology blocks. We've called this our range of technology the CryoCap portfolio. CryoCap because it mostly uses cryogenic technology for capturing the CO2. So cryogenic capture. So that's our CryoCap product range. We have different solutions for different markets. The CryoCap H2 is the one you saw in the picture at the beginning. It's for hydrogen plants, refining. The CryoCap Oxy is one that is well suited for power production or oxy-combustion. CryoCap Steel for blast furnace CO2 capture. We'll see next slide, there's one in construction in Belgium currently. CryoCap NG for large or CO2-rich natural gas. You don't want to produce natural gas and vent the CO2 which is associated to the production to the atmosphere. So we can also recapture it and send it back. And eventually CryoCap FG, this one, we're probably looking a little bit above the $50 because it's what we call flue gases or diluted sources of CO2. So it's a little bit more expensive to capture it, but still competitive. And all of these are using reference proven technologies. And all of them are known for decades. You see here in more details the suite of technology that we've developed for our customers in these different markets. Again, hydrogen production, upstream power, cement, fluid catalytic cracking, steel, CO2 liquefaction. So for these markets, we have answers, and we have answers that are likely going to be in this, $50 or below dollars per ton. Of course, it depends on multiple factors, but that's what we're after, because we know there are regulations that and tax incentives that can help pay for the technology. We haven't waited the recent years to start on this. Since the early 2000, we started by conceptual studies, developing our technology bricks. We then tested them individually. You see here on relatively small volumes. And eventually we moved with some pilot testings in the early 2010. After 2010, we saw a wave of pretty big projects in different industry, the steel industry, the power industry. Then our first commercial plants were built, and this is the one we saw in France. This one is in Canada. It's connected to a CO2 pipeline, which is the Alberta trunk line, which is the largest CO2 pipeline worldwide. This one is also one of the largest CO2 capture plants worldwide, 3,700 tons per day of CO2. That's in excess of 1 million tons per year. Significant. And the CO2 in that location is used for enhanced oil recovery. A most recent interesting project that I mentioned here, this one is going to start up at the end of the year. It's called Stilanol. It's a CO2 PSA installed downstream a blast furnace. We're doing that in Belgium with Arcelor, and the CO2 that will be produced will be sent to fermenters where yeast will convert the CO2 into ethanol. So it's also another way to generate value from CO2, converting the CO2 into something else. And we keep going. Hopefully, we'll be successful by having more of these plants deployed. We're working on multiple projects in the US for that. You see it's pretty favorable. So we're hoping to very soon announce more of these projects. I talked about that plant at the beginning. I think we're quite proud about this one. It's the first cryogenic capture plant installed at a refinery. It has been successfully working since 2015. This plant you see here is supplying hydrogen to ExxonMobil in northern France. And we started in 2015. The integration was successful. The operations of the compressor, the cold box, and the membranes that are used in that plant has also been very, very reliable. And we've also been able to increase the hydrogen production. So that's also a very good value for the project. So we by around 15%. This plant is using proven technologies: centrifugal compression, partial condensation, membranes. We have an additional module for food-grade liquid CO2. So sometimes it could be worth also adding this small module where on the big plant where you know that close by you might have consumers for food and beverage that would require CO2, that would generate also extra revenue to the project. And you see here on the back some of the CO2 storages. So we're deploying this technology worldwide to other air liquide plants, to other third-party customers. This has been proven, and that's one of the many technologies we're offering today to capture CO2 from industrial facilities. So that's enough for today. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I hope you've enjoyed the presentation.
APLA organiza la primera reunión virtual latinoamericana de petroquímica, que tendrá como objetivo generar un espacio de nuevas experiencias y oportunidades, desafiando las nuevas tecnologías y adaptándonos a los nuevos paradigmas de negocios. Sigamos conectados. APLA Anual Virtual, 9 y 10 de noviembre. Los esperamos.